Hello, everyone. How are you? This lecture will be for Monday, May 18th, and we are in the home stretch. I just counted the calendar. We have 17 more days of school left. We have a week of three, a week of four, and then back to back weeks of five. All right, so that adds up by my mathematical reasoning to 17. We have a 3 day week this week, and then we have Ascension Thursday, Extension Friday into the Memorial Day weekend. So we have that to look forward to. The way I see the rest of our year going is two more tests and one more written persuasive assignment. Um, I'm thinking that our first test, I don't have a date yet for you, but it will be encompassing the years of 1945, so the end of the war with the dropping of the atomic bomb up till about 1969, 1970. And then our last test of the year will be 1970s to the current day. And I have some ideas I'm mulling over about our persuasive writing assignment, which I will get you more details and a due date when I get my act together. All right, so I'm going to go full screen here so that we can see a little bit better what we're doing. I hope you guys are all doing well and hanging in there. Summer is upon us. Grind it out. Another 17 days. Make sure your grades are good. Reach out for help if you need it. If you submitted your Twitter persuasive, some of you needed to give me a character count, which some of you did. I graded them. They're all up to date. And if you need to still do that assignment, please do it so I can get your grades updated. Okay, so let's go full screen. All right, so we are in the Truman presidency. Remember that Truman is FDR's vice president in his last term. FDR wins the election of 1944, dies early 1945. And so Truman is finishing out FDR's fourth term. That's where we currently are. All right, so he is going to continue FDR's New Deal. He's a Democrat. FDR is a Democrat. The economy has improved. Adapting to this post-war economy, prices are going to rise. He backs the GI Bill, which, if you remember, gave educational and college opportunities to veterans returning home. Men are now back into the workforce, which means that ladies, unfortunately, you guys are leaving the factories and the workforce in bigger numbers and headed back to your domestic responsibilities inside the house. And, the whole 1950s picture perfect suburban landscape of, small house, two kids, wife with a picket fence and a Cadillac in the driveway, we're going to start to get into that idea as we move into this next unit. Now, remember, the workers are going to benefit during World War II. They're needed more than ever. They're not just producing consumer goods. They're not producing goods for the war effort. Unionization will grow. Power of the labor movement will grow. Wages will be on an upward trajectory. But as we all know, when one thing in America pushes one way, there's an equal force that's going to push it back in the other direction. So Democrats have been in charge for quite a while. Crisis typically moves things leftward because the people who suffer the most in a crisis are usually the working class and the poorest and the most vulnerable of people. So as unemployment numbers go up and death counts go up and stories of that spread, typically you see American politics move in a leftward direction. But we, of course, that's going to fizzle out like anything else. So we are going to be going from 2 decades of Democratic leadership back into Republican leadership by 1952 with Dwight Eisenhower. So just a couple of things here to point out. Operation Dixie, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which were basically the two major work labor unions in the country, they want to spread to the South. All right. And they're going to create huge strikes in steel, auto, and coal industries. Nearly 5 million workers nationwide are going to support this. Truman is vehemently opposed to this. Typically, unionization was a northern city-led movement. The spread of it to the South, then you get into the whole idea of right-to-work states, which we still have in this country today. There are states in the South and in the Southwest of the country that are vehemently against unionization and are called right-to-work states, meaning that you can't force laborers and workers to join unions if they don't want to, that they have the right to work. On the other side of that would be the right to organize and collectively bargain. So there's a push back and forth and a wax and wane basically from the industrial age. But the South had never, remember, the South is agriculturally based. But what's happening is the more unions exist in the North, the more manufacturers want to move their factories to the South for cheaper labor. And then as wages are going to start to go up in the South, then American manufacturers are going to want to move their factories outside the country to places like China and India and Vietnam and Malaysia, where a lot of our things are produced today, all for the idea of cheaper labor. And if you or I were a manufacturer, we would move our factories to every single corner of the world where we could find a vulnerable population that would work for less money. Okay? Now, there are good, there are bad. But this is the first migration, if you will, of factories to the South, and union efforts are going to follow it. Now, talking about this pushback, Republicans are going to sweep the midterm elections in 1946. Fear of labor uprising. I'm sure the 5 million strikers in the South didn't help. Congress is going to veto most of Truman's Fair Deal and pass the Taft-Hartley Act against unions, which was basically a check on the Wagner Act of 1935, which was a major win for the working class. Now the Republican Congress is going to push back against that. Remember, unions are a good thing. They can also be a bad thing. Like any other group that organizes and comes together, all right, once they achieve their initial goals of better wages, safer working conditions, they're going to keep pushing the envelope because now they're a power structure like anything else. So one could argue that manufacturers would not have moved to the South and then not have moved to China if it hadn't been for unions continually pushing wages up. So there is no right or wrong here. Of course, working class people want more and more money. That makes sense. They're working hard. They don't want to be poor, or else why would you work? On the other hand, if you're the manufacturer and you're the owner of the business, why would you want to constantly be under the threat of strike and boycott and union organization efforts against you when you're employing them in the first place and you are providing a valuable service by making a product that the country needs or wants, while also employing, thousands, tens of thousands of people, which helps the economy grow. So like anything else, there has to be a balance. So you have some pictures here of unions striking in the southern states. And then you have Operation Dixie. Black leaf house workers in eastern North Carolina unionized in 1946, the first pro-union vote at a tobacco factory 1 block west, precursor to the civil rights movement. So that's an interesting point. Labor unions are about workers coming together for equal rights, okay? And whatever they see that as, workplace safety restrictions or guards, better wages, more protection. All right. Civil rights movement is about people getting equality, people getting treated more fairly like everybody else in society. So these two things are tied together. And if you remember, we were talking about civil rights, all right, coming out of World War II. Over 1 million Black Americans served in segregated units in World War II. All right. And that is really going to be the beginning of the civil rights movement. Even though we don't have Martin Luther King and the marches and the boycotts yet, that's what's coming in the 1950s and 1960s. World War II is going to set the stage for that. And the growth of the union labor, because remember, most Black Americans are working class, poorer Americans. Those things are going to be tied together. All right. Now, Truman, as a Democrat, is going to fight for Black civil rights. Now, it's a little strange because Black people tended to vote Republican, all right, from the days of Abraham Lincoln and, Ulysses S. Grant and Reconstruction. The Black people of America, the former slaves, voted Republican, and they still voted Republican into the early and middle 1900s. That's going to start to change right around this time, all right? So Northern Democrats, all right, like a JFK, like an FDR, like a Truman, is going to be much more moderate in their views of Black equal rights than Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats are the descendants of the slaveholders, all right? Northern Democrats are somewhere in the middle. They're for the worker, they're for free market, but they're for equality and civil rights and a more, egalitarian society, if you will. All right. So this is going to kind of paint the picture for some problems that are coming in the political landscape over this next decade. Between 1945 and 51, 11 states established fair employment practice commissions. That means that they are going to make sure that workers are being treated fairly. NAACP launches a voter registration campaign in the South. 20% increase by 1952, which was a seven-fold increase. So what that means is that the NAACP is going to fight for black voting rights in the South. If you remember, the 15th Amendment gave all black men the right to vote, but the percentage numbers in the South from the 1860s all the way to the 1940s and 50s was very, very meager because of the poll tax and the literacy test and the grandfather clause. Those things existed for almost 100 years, all right? Lynching, which we talked about in the early 1900s and again in the 1920s, this murdering of people outside of the law where people were not brought to justice. All right. So you talk about voting on one hand, you're also talking about perhaps being killed for trying to vote on the other. And the people that did it don't get brought to justice. All right. Now, that is a completely lawless society. And if you're going to ever have any sort of equality, you have to fix that right away. So law enforcement is going to begin to notice and have a reaction to lynching. The media will pick it up more. The federal government will be looking to get involved in laws against lynching. Brooklyn Dodgers were going to have their first black baseball player in 1947, Jackie Robinson. And Jackie's number 42 is retired across every single Major League Baseball team. So if any of you ever make it to the major leagues, you will not be wearing number 42 as a result of Jackie. Truman asked for broad civil rights reform, federal laws against lynching and the poll tax, equal access to jobs and education, and the Republican-led Congress says no. So World War II is over. The Great Depression is over. But the new issues of the day, the stage is being set for civil rights equality showdown in this country. All right. And Truman is going to be on the side of pushing that agenda for more civil rights for African Americans. All right. Now, right as the election of 1948 starts to kick off, Truman is going to desegregate the armed forces by an executive order. He's not going to ask Congress for permission to do that. Now, it's kind of interesting because Harry Truman, right? I mean, you're the president, so you're the commander in chief. You basically, besides asking for a declaration of war, you run the military. All right. And this doesn't have a declaration of war or any sort of expenditure of money involved in it. This simply matters about the operationalization of the armed forces. So can white and black people serve together? They didn't during World War II. But the big problem, right? One's willing to die for their country. The other one's willing to die for their country. Both did die for their country. How then can you bring them back to America after they did that, after they did what you asked them to do and fight for our freedom and our democratic ways? All right. How can you then bring them back here and say, well, you go to that school and you go to this school, or you go to that diner and you go to this diner, or you can vote or you can't vote, or if you get hurt, you have due process through court, and if you do, you don't. All right. That's not going to work. So many people think that the first public venue to be desegregated is the schools, and we will talk about Brown v. the Board of Ed at some point next week, but it's actually the military, and it does make sense, especially coming out of a war, that if there is going to be one part of society where it shouldn't matter what color you are, all right, as long as you're willing to pick up a gun and fight for the red, white, and blue, you should be all fighting together for the same cause, okay? So this is going to flip out many of the southern states, and it's going to create a problem in the election of 1948. So this is just a newspaper clipping here. President Truman wipes out segregation in the armed forces. And there's Jackie Robinson. Now, the election of 1948. If you wondered why the political map from the 1860s to this election shows blue in the South and red in the North, and today we see blue in the North and red in the South, meaning Democrats and Republicans. When did that switch take place? That switch is going to start to take place right now. It's not going to be a full-fledged switch right away, but this is going to set the stage for the Democratic Party splitting, okay, and the South becoming increasingly Republican while the North became increasingly Democrat. Now, The split in the Democratic Party along racial tolerance lines. They call themselves the Dixiecrats. Remember, the Democrats are the party of states' rights, of slavery, of Jim Crow, of Klan activity, of involvement. That's nothing what you think about the Democratic Party today. All right? So, how did it change? The Deep South is going to create a states' rights Democratic Party and nominated Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, who called from the complete segregation of the races. So Truman is a Democrat. Strom Thurmond and the people of the South are Democrats. Yet Truman is now looked at as an enemy, as an outsider, as a Northerner, because he is desegregating the military. And you don't need to be that smart to see which way the wind is blowing here, because if you can desegregate the military, then you can desegregate the schools, the hospitals, the government, and just about anything else that where there was separation of the races, which was the way of life for 70 or 80 years in the South. That is going to start to be unlayered, if you will. All right. Now, interestingly, Truman has enemies on the right in his party, which is this states' rights Democratic Party, and on the left in his party because he's not being progressive enough. So he is getting attacked within his own party on both sides of the aisle. On one side, he's a race traitor who's desegregating the military. And on the other side, he's not doing enough against race inequality. He's spending too much money on the Cold War, and economic cooperation with the Soviet Union is something that should be sought because it would kind of tone down the fear and the increasing military spending and militaristic nature of the Cold War. So on the left, they're going to nominate. So this is an election where you have three Democratic candidates, progressive left being Henry Wallace, Truman being the center left, and Strom Thurmond being, I guess, the right-wing left, if that makes any sense. All right? Now, we have seen in the past that when a party gets split, then the other party, the competing party, should win. All right? We saw that happen to Abraham Lincoln. We saw that happen in the election of 1912 when Woodrow Wilson won. All right. So this split is supposed to kill Truman and give the election to Thomas Dewey, who is a New York Republican. Every single poll that predicted this election had Dewey winning. Well, they were wrong. And this is actually thought to be the biggest upset election in the history of our country. 1948. Truman is going to win in a landslide. All right. A centrist. Thurmond carried 4 deep red states, foreshadowing the current situation of every southern state being Republican. And check out this map. All right. So all of the blue is Truman. All of the red is Dewey, the Republican. All right. And then the gold there is Strom Thurmond. So those states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, those are deep cotton southern states, had the biggest holdings of plantations and slaves, were the biggest perpetrators of segregation, Jim Crow, and lynching. And there they are. They're staying within the Democratic Party, but they're saying the Truman Democrats, they're not like us. We're different than them. We are still pro-segregation. We do not want the desegregation of society. And that is the beginning of a split and a turn in our political map landscape that is going to increase. And I'll show you the maps as we go. And you'll see where we get to the current day, where Democrats are mostly north and left, west coast, and Republicans are typically south and the more rural areas of the country. So let's see how we're doing on time here. 18. All right, so let's finish this. All right. Now, we said on the first day of Cold War that the biggest word or the most frequent word that we could use is fear. All right. And what are we fearful of? We're fearful of the Soviet Union. We're fearful of the spread of communism. Now, that's a fear that can be put out there in the world, and our military and foreign policy will reflect that. But that's also a fear inside of our own country. And we talked about soft power and the nature of a Cold War versus a hot war, where no fighting is really going on between the two main adversaries, the United States and the Soviet Union. But there's an arms race. There's a race to space, which we're going to talk about. There's the creation of intelligence agencies. There's spying on one another to try to see what the other one is up to, try to get one step ahead of them. All right? So This fear of communism is going to lead to free speech suppression. Free speech is protected in our First Amendment civil liberties. Truman is going to establish a loyalty review system for government employees. Now, here's the problem. In America, you're allowed to say what you want. But if you are allowed to say what you want, and then you are able to be labeled either loyal or disloyal, then the government is basically controlling what your thoughts are and what you're allowed to say. And that's not exactly the way our country is set up. All right. So they're going to go after teachers, professors, actors, activists, homosexuals. All right. Rooted out and fired from their job, thought to be open to blackmailing by Russians. All right. And this is a big, big government overstep in our civil liberties. In 1947, the House of Representatives will create an Un-American Activities Committee investigating Hollywood for communist influence. Remember, working class people, intelligent people in the form of free thought, journalists, professors, teachers, activists, actors, artists, writers, all right? If you were to speak out against the government or say in any capacity that some part of communism was a positive, you could then be under investigation by this organization. And a future president named Richard Nixon, who's a Republican from California, he is going to start to build his political profile serving on this House Un-American Activities Committee, all right? And they are going to bring this group called the Hollywood 10, directors and studio executives, refused to answer congressional questions. They refused to name names. They believed it violated their First Amendment rights. They served jail terms and were blacklisted by Hollywood studios. So America is not supposed to be divided on what you think, okay? America can be divided, or at least it can be divided on what you think, but no government is supposed to come after you for what you think. As long as you are being peaceful and not putting people at risk, all right, then you are allowed to pretty much say what you want and think what you want in this country, all right? Now, you could argue that if these people were communists, they could be working for the Russians. But we get into this paranoia, this fear, because if you can do it with one person, now you can do it 100, 1,000, 1,000,000, 10 million, and then a government is getting more powerful. And if this catches on, you start to control people through fear. Just like Hitler scapegoated the Jews for the problems of Germany, what would happen if the Democratic or the Republican Party started to scapegoat Jews or professors or teachers or, journalists or college educated or whoever it was, free-thinking people? What if they were going to start to scapegoat them for the problems of America, all under the guise that they might be communist spies, all right? Just because you believe that something about socialism or communism is good does not mean that you are guilty of a crime or spying for the Soviet Union. Now, one of the more famous spy trial cases that comes out of this time period is the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg case. So they are a working class Jewish communist couple in New York City. They get accused of passing secrets of an atomic bomb to Soviet agents during World War II, and the chief accuser is Ethel's brother, David Greenglass. The evidence is spotty or circumstantial, meaning that it didn't definitely prove that they were guilty. They had little evidence against Ethel, and Greenglass actually later admitted to lying. The atmosphere of hysteria, this fear, this widespread, deep fear and paranoia that there were communists just running through our country, led to them being convicted and sentenced to death by electric chair in the state of New York. They were executed at Sing Sing Prison, which is up in Ossining, which is in Westchester. All right, and this is carried out in 1953. It reinforced the idea that an army of Soviet spies was at work in the United States. And this is a picture of them, and I have a little video to show you about it.
Early 1950, that the British were able to arrest Klaus Fuchs.
Fuchs was considered brilliant. He was considered to have a virtually photographic memory, a brilliant theoretical and mathematical physicist, and they didn't have any clue that he was actually giving everything that he looked at to the Soviet Union.
Klaus Fuchs is the first link in a chain leading to one of the biggest spy scandals in American history.
Fuchs identifies a man who served as his go-between with the Russians, named David Greenglass. David Greenglass explains that he was recruited for spying by his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg.
Julius Rosenberg has a small machine shop in the Bronx. He's arrested in July 1950. His wife Ethel, David Greenglass's sister, a month later. Both are members of the Communist Party. Court filings present them as super spies. They refuse to talk, pleading the fifth instead. They have little chance, especially when Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, testifies against them. Both are found guilty and sentenced to death.
There were multiple attempts to plead for pardoning or clemency or commutation of sentencing. All of this was rejected. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are executed in Sing Sing prison by electric chair.
Debate about their guilt or innocence lasts for decades. Until 1995, when previously classified documents revealed the prosecution knew a lot more than ever came out in court.
During World War II, the United States intercepted a large number of Soviet communications, and they spent an immense amount of time to try and crack these codes.
They were from a spy program, codenamed Venona.
We now know we've been able to get access to those decrypted communications, and it's pretty clear that Julius Rosenberg is a spy.
Spies are never referred to by name in Soviet communications.
Julius had a fancy code name because he was an important person. His code name was Antenna.
Ethel was a different story.
Ethel is referred to in the files as Ethel. That's a sign that she isn't a spy. That's a sign that she's the wife of a spy or something like that. It's very minor.
Information from the Venona papers could have convicted Julius, but exonerated Ethel.
Here's the thing, though. The United States does not want the Soviet Union to know that it has cracked its codes, so it will never use that evidence in court.
A government secret deemed so important, Ethel Rosenberg lost her life to ensure it wasn't divulged.
All right, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. All right, so let's wrap this up. So McCarthyism, I don't know if you guys have heard about Joe McCarthy. Now, we talked about the Red Scare coming out of World War I. Was it the first, widespread fear of socialism and communism in the United States? Kind of goes away a bit during Great Depression and World War II because there's bigger fish to fry. Well, now it's going to be back, and it's going to be bigger than ever because of this standoff, this Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So Joe McCarthy is a little-known senator from Wisconsin. He announces that he has a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. None of them were ever proven. McCarthy is a master self-promoter, so he knows how to talk and communicate. He knows how to persuade people. He knows how to manipulate people's emotions in order to get them to change their attitudes and their actions. And he uses Senate subcommittees to engage in these witch hunts against numerous individuals. And if you look at that right there, the witch hunts, right? Like you think about the Salem witch trials, and I believe that history shows that, they were not actually witches. I don't know that you can actually be a witch and, put spells on people. And there's a lot of different historical, answers for why the Salem witch trials took place. But we do see this word witch hunt. It's basically when somebody is going after somebody innocently just to prove a political point. All right. So it's originally backed by the Republicans as a counterweight to the Truman administration. However, it's later repudiated during Eisenhower's first term as a bully and someone who makes outrageous claims with zero proof. Now, think about it. When somebody in power, whether that be a president, a senator, a congressman, a state official, a local official, makes a statement with zero proof, it's dangerous because people believe it. Okay? I mean, just think about that. If the president says something, if a senator says something, or Congress says something, People believe it, especially if it's somebody in your own political party because you think that they are backing you. So that is an enormous responsibility that they have. And McCarthy is going to try to build himself up as a politician by doing this. He knows that there's an appetite in the country for fear-mongering over communism, and he is going to exploit that fear. It's a picture of Joe. Now, this atmosphere of fear. Fear of communism is rampant in American society and government at all three levels. Loyalty oaths for certain professions. Now, think about it. A teacher or a professor or a journalist that's writing about the news or talking about a topic on a college campus or teaching history, all right? Bias comes out in all of those things because every single person is biased. So as a teacher, you're not supposed to give your political views. You're supposed to play it down the middle and let the students decide for themselves. But if the government wants you to believe that communism is horrible and that there are communist spies throughout the country, and if you believe that there isn't adequate proof for that, and you present that to your students that, hey, there might be, but there also might not be. So gather your own facts, question everything, and think for yourself. That sort of thing is going to start to be looked at as disloyal to our country. So you're dividing the country into an us versus a them, and that is exactly what Hitler did by scapegoating the Jews. You have to be very, very careful when you do an us versus a them. No us is always right, no them is always wrong, and vice versa. Just like no one political party is always right and the other one always wrong. The world is just not that simple, okay? So because of the fear, we abandon a bit our understanding of this two-way road that America has always been, all right? And we've talked about the sides of America from the very, very beginning. And America has become the greatest and most prosperous and wealthiest and safest country in the world, while the two sides have competed against each other, fought a civil war, been at each other's throats, yet up and up and up we went. Because at the end of the day, there was enough respect for the other side to continue to do what was important for everybody, okay? The banning of un-American books like Robin Hood, I don't know if you know the Robin Hood story, but what did Robin Hood do? He stole from the rich and gave to the poor, all right? And if you are a millionaire in the 1950s, what a communist or socialist wants to do is take your money and give it to people that are less deserving. The courts are going to do little to stop this kind of thing, protecting First Amendment rights of suspected communists. In the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover started keeping records on suspected communists, political dissenters, meaning people that spoke against the politicians in power, homosexuals, and left-wing professors. Americans used fear of communism to exploit their enemies. Democrats versus Republicans, business versus labor, free market versus socialism. So everything is going to start to get framed in this us versus them mentality. If you're with us, you're loyal, you're for free market, you're for business, and if you're disloyal, you're for left-wing political ideology, you're for working class unionization rights, and you're for socialism. And this is going to be, we still have elements of this in our society today. Not so really much over communism as much, although you have been hearing a lot about that lately on the right, that those on the left are trying to push us into some sort of socialist or communist regime. So it is still out there. The left will call the right wing fascist, and the right will call the left wing communist. But it is definitely more toned down, I would say, than during this Cold War. All right, I hope you're all doing well, and I will speak to you tomorrow.